Good morning and welcome to First Off, Let's Kill All the Lawyers. I'm David Heffernan and I've been practicing personal injury law here in Florida for nearly 30 years. And we've named this podcast First Off, Let's Kill All the Lawyers because Shakespeare said it back in the 15th century. And sadly, a lot of people still think it's not a bad idea. So goal here is to bring in other lawyers that have practiced in South Florida. Learn a little bit about them, learn a little bit about their practice, and maybe slowly remove a few off of the kill list, although there's a few I definitely want to keep on there. My guest today I'm very, very excited about because when I say we go way back, we go way back.
We don't need to use the years.
No, we won't go to the years, but a little undergrad at UM at the same time. Then we wound up in law school together. Did mock trials and trial competitions and traveled around for the University of Miami doing that, and then went on to both teach in the faculty and the trial program at UM. You've gone on to do far more teaching than that, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But Celeste Higgins, my pleasure to have you here today because once we sort of got through law school, things stayed the same and we're both trial lawyers, but we went on totally different paths.
We sure did.
So you go and clerk for Federal Judge Moreno.
I did. I was very fortunate and very lucky. I guess that's the same thing. But I was very lucky to have the opportunity to do so. Judge Moreno was at the time coming onto the federal bench and in need of a law clerk. And so I applied. I didn't think I had any chance of getting it, but luckily I did. It was an incredible experience. I don't think I knew what being a law clerk was. It was one of those things that in law school people talked about, you should put in for clerkships.
Sounds impressive, but
nobody really tells you what that is,
right.
Other than it's like something nice you put on your resume. You basically work with the judge. The judge will listen to cases or has cases, and the judge will instruct you, okay, this is what I want you to do some research on. Give me a draft of what it should be, and you discuss the cases. But more importantly, the biggest part of it, or the best part of it, I suppose, is the writing experience and the experience that you get as with a bird's eye view of what goes on in the courtroom and what really inspires a judge to listen or to be persuaded. Obviously, judges have to follow the law. Whatever the law is in that district must be followed. Whatever we have in the 11th Circuit is what we have to go by. But it gives you an opportunity to really see how it evolves. And there is a lot of hands-on experience that the law clerks have, in addition to watching very experienced, very good trial lawyers coming into the courtroom, and then a few not so good ones.
It's funny because I tell my students all the time, I said, look, when you get the opportunity, sit in, watch a trial, sit in, watch a deposition. For that very reason, I said, you're going to see some really, really good things. Go watch, motion calendar. And you're going to see some really, really bad things too. And when you're sort of off to the side, it really sort of hits home on that. You see somebody that, makes an argument that won't stop after that. You can see the judge has already clearly made up his or her mind and they keep yammering. And you're like, yeah, you're going to talk your way out of a favorable ruling here. So it's a great thing for them to be able to experience. But let's go back a step. What got you to go to law school? Was this something you always wanted to do, or?
Yes. I think, and I think I've talked about this before in other platforms. I knew from the time I was about 13. I was reading, you're studying in school, you're reading about the nascent stages of our country and how the Constitution is created and what were the influences of that. And for some reason, that spoke to me. And I identified with the concepts that were in the Constitution, that were in the amendments. And I didn't know at the time where within that structure I fit in. I thought perhaps I would go into politics. And then I learned that most politicians were lawyers. And so that I just sort of went that route. Sometimes people ask you, well, what would you be doing if you weren't a lawyer? I probably would have pursued a career in acting. But frankly, that skill set served me well as a trial lawyer because it was part of the idea that I liked getting in front of people and expressing and persuading, which is one of the things that I harp on a lot when I teach trial skills, is that this is a skill of persuasion more than anything else. But I identified with somebody who wanted to represent the underdog from a very early age.
Well, we share that because I was an aspiring actor as well. Okay. And actually did a few parts in some movies and some TV commercials and all of that. And then sort of got routed through the NFL and sort of stumbled my way into law school, not sure what I wanted to do at the time. So I wasn't 13 wanting to be a lawyer. I was older going, and I had a degree in communications. And I said, well, you really can't stay in the same market. You really, whether you're doing radio or TV or anything else, you kind of have to start in a smaller market and then go to a bigger market and whatnot. And I'm like, for the last 4 years, I packed everything I owned in my car to go from 4 different NFL cities. And I'm like, tired of moving. So I went to law school, not knowing that I would enjoy it as much as I did, because once I got into it, all of a sudden I realized, and it was the trial program that I'm like, okay, I like this competition. I like, it equates a lot to my athletic mindset of really, it's all the preparation. The game time's really nice, but you got to do the homework ahead of time. So you go clerk for Judge Moreno, and then you become a federal public defender.
Yes.
So let's talk about that, because my view on public defenders, and I want to talk a little bit of different state and federal, but has always been, it's such a critical role for the Constitution and what we do in this country. That being said, I don't know that I could ever do it. Okay. It takes some real fortitude to be able to understand, hey, I'm defending the Constitution and these people have rights no matter what they've done. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the things that you've seen, but what drew you to become a federal public defender?
I had already interviewed at the state public defender's office and had been offered a job. And I was so thankful. I recognized, and here's a shout out to not only the local public defender's office, but the state attorney's office as well. It's an incredible training ground for lawyers coming out of law school. It gives them the opportunity to really learn what it is to be trial lawyers.
Well, it gets them in a courtroom, which you can't
exactly
do. I mean, in the civil practice anymore. I mean, I was fortunate I got in the courtroom pretty early, but for a young lawyer in civil to try to get in the courtroom now is difficult.
It's really the only way right now to get that experience, unless you're just incredibly lucky. But generally, it's one of those places where whatever training and experience you get as a law student is very minimal compared to what you will then get when you go to one of these offices. And they're usually they usually have some very great training programs within those offices. And I was lucky; I got an offer. But when I got the clerkship with Judge Moreno, I was able to see what was going on in the federal system. I also got very lucky that at that time, the federal public defender's office in the Southern District of Florida was growing. There was a new federal public defender. He was looking for new talent. He had hired a chief assistant who was also looking for new talent. They were looking to grow this new office with young and aspiring trial lawyers. And I happened to be at the right place at the right time, honestly. One of the supervisors had been my teacher at the Lit Skills program at University of Miami, endorsed my skills, and there I was. And 4 months later, I think it was 4 months later, I was in a real live trial in federal court in Key West. And I did not know what had hit me to make me so lucky.
Wow. Okay. Well, good place to start. I mean, the federal courthouse in Key West is kind of nice if you've got to be down there. So let's talk about the federal public defender. I mean, what does a public defender do?
Well, okay. So at a minimum, Gideon versus Wainwright establishes the fact that anybody who is looking at jail time, anybody who is looking at a crime where they potentially can go to jail, they are entitled to a lawyer. That seems like an obvious thing for most of us, but it wasn't the case prior to that opinion, and so offices all around the country sprout up. For me, what it represents is an opportunity to help people who cannot afford their own representation, which, if you are charged with a federal crime, would be about 90% of the people.
Okay.
Federal.
And why do you say that?
The cases that come to federal court are no less serious than the state court cases like murder and rape and molestation cases. However, they do tend to be a little bit more complex. They are usually those investigations are very proactive. The law enforcement officers who do those cases take a long time to gather evidence, to gather information. There are nuanced cases. Most of them are, right now anyway, are fraud cases that are very paper intensive, or at this point, digitally intensive. It's not uncommon for us to have a terabyte of information. And so those cases are expensive to represent, because they require a lot of man hours. They require a lot of discovery evidence review,
right,
and a lot of preparation. And those cases are not brought easily or quickly by law enforcement in the federal system. And so they're usually very well investigated and very well prepared. And so it takes an enormous amount of skill as well as just time and effort to go through and prepare for those cases. Whereas a lot of the state cases that you might see burglaries and assaults and robberies and carjackings, and those are often reactive cases. Somebody's caught at the spot, or it's just a police officer gets called, and those cases are not less prepared in the sense of when they go to trial, but there's not a lot to go back, and there's not a lot of historic material to review. And like I said, they're not any less serious. It's just that the way that they are investigated doesn't require as many hours. There's also a difference in that the state system, you litigate, a lot of what you're litigating is orally, either at a hearing before the trial or at the trial. And in federal court, every pleading, everything that is litigated is done with paper and has to be accompanied by a memorandum of law. There's a lot of writing, and that skill set is an addition to oral advocacy.
All right, so hold on. You're telling me there's a lot of fraud in South Florida?
Never knew, huh?
Never knew. That's a new concept.
I believe it is the fraud capital of the country.
We are number one, and we can take pride in that with some of that. And we'll talk a little bit about that, but in the federal court system, one of the things that's a little different than state, and as you clerked, you got to see both civil trials and civil cases and criminal, because they're both in the same. State has them separated. You've got a state, criminal courthouse and a state civil courthouse. So what drew you to the criminal side and the criminal defense side?
I think still the concept that I really firmly believed, that everybody is entitled to a representation, to good representation. I wasn't good when I started, but I was certainly aiming toward it. And I also the values and the concepts that are in our amendments that we handle, whether it's the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the Sixth Amendment, those are things that very much spoke to me and that were of interest to me. And it was a natural fit for me. I'm not saying that the matters that are handled in civil cases are not equally important for other reasons. They just didn't draw my attention the way the criminal matters did. Okay.
Well, and certainly, yeah. I mean, the criminal, you're wed to the Constitution. And you look at, and I'm always sort of in awe when you look back that these guys drafted this so long ago, and how artful it is, and how, it sort of continues to kind of evolve. But one of the things I think that's important, because people say, oh, well, why should we give defense lawyers? Well, you pointed it out. Guess what? The state attorney's office is loaded with really good lawyers. and they're going to prosecute. The victim doesn't have to prosecute the case. The state's going to do it, or the federal bench is going to do it and go after it. So yeah, it does at least level the playing field to say somebody's going to get a fair trial.
It does. The federal defender's office here, not just because I came from that, but it is really an exceptional office. I think all around the country, the federal defender offices, the public defender offices are stellar places filled with very motivated, very intelligent young lawyers, new lawyers coming out of law schools. And there are also some lawyers that have been there for quite a long, but career defense attorneys who stay there. I was at the federal defender's office for 28 years. For all practical purposes, I was a career federal defender or public defender. There is, unfortunately, in the media as well as among other lawyers, there's a bit of a stigma or a bit of a label that, oh, well, you're a public defender. That means that you couldn't really go out on your own and have your own law firm, and which is obviously not true. It's just that, one of the things that being a public defender or a state attorney or a U.S. attorney, one of the things that it gives you is the opportunity to practice law in a manner that's very pristine, in that you don't need to involve the practice of business.
Right.
And so what people don't understand is that when you go to law school, no one teaches you how to run a law firm.
Right.
No one teaches you how to collect bills, how to establish anything. And when I went from law school to the public defender's office, it was a great mix because I didn't need to learn that skill set. I've since needed to learn that skill set. And not everybody likes it. I happen to really enjoy it. But not everybody likes it. But what it gives you is an opportunity to simply focus on the practice of law, which is something that most people don't get. But I think we should also mention the fact that what you and I do represents maybe 5% of all lawyering within the law community, within the legal community. Most lawyers don't ever go to court. Most lawyers, whether if they're transactional lawyers, never go to court. There's real estate, there's trust and estates. There's a lot of other fields that where lawyers practice that don't require them to go to court. But you don't see that on television.
Right.
No one's doing a Law and Order on real estate transactions. I'm not saying that that's a bad practice. I'm just saying that it doesn't translate over to the sexy stuff that people want to see on television. What they see is the litigation part. So when people think, I want to be a lawyer, they're thinking, I want to be that person that I saw on Law and Order or in whatever movie that they saw, where the person gets up in the courtroom and announces things, which is actually a very few, as far as numbers go, very few of us actually do that.
It has, and I've been doing this, almost 30 years. I still have never had a motion in my pocket that I can hand to opposing counsel like they do on TV. They go, well, that's never coming in. Well, yes, here it is. Here's the motion, and I'm like, never carried one in my pocket, but sooner or later, I'm going to just keep some in my pocket just so I can pull one out and do it. So let's talk. You've shifted gears. Your career as a public defender. You've now gone out into the private sector, and you're working for Bozorgi. Is that the correct?
Bozorgi Law.
Bozorgi Law. Okay,
I'm
and Susan Bozorgi.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about the type of work that you do there.
So there's 4 of us in the law firm, and I'm very proud to say it's 4 women, 4 really powerful, tough women.
I know you look at the website. It's scary when you look at this. Like, I don't want to take on those 4 women. Okay.
What I think all of us are committed to is defense work, and what I mean by that is that our focus is on defending. Whether we're defending an executive who finds herself in some problems, within her corporation, whether it's the CEO, CFO of a corporation, whether it's an individual who has been prosecuted in the federal system, whether it's an individual who's accused of something and we're not yet even in the like indictment or complaint stage. What we are focused on is representing individuals. And and defending individuals. And then we take that very seriously. And the reason I say that is because, law firms can do a lot of different white collar representation that includes compliance and all of those things. And those are interesting and also important areas that we like to get into. But when we really think about what we do, we represent and defend and defend. That's basically it. Now, we don't have as much of the guns and drugs that we were raised on. Susan went to
the 80s aren't around anymore. It's not all cocaine and
no, yeah, not really. Well, I mean, it still exists, right? It's still out there. There is still in many ways a war on drugs, and that's a different discussion for a different day. But I'm not saying that I would not, if somebody came to my office and needed my help with that kind of a case, that I would turn it away. No, of course not. If I can help them and the circumstances were right, of course I would take that on. But there's also a different kind of practice as well, which has slowly evolved within the corporate world, and we're focused on that as well.
All right. So all those years as a public defender and now defending people, when we talk about the Constitution, how do you respond when people, and I'm sure you've gotten the question, hey, how can you defend that scumbag? Look at what he did or she did, and how can you defend that?
I think every criminal defense attorney has a historical account of how they've answered that question over the years.
That's what I figured.
For some people, it starts with, I'm just representing the Constitution. For other people, it's everybody is entitled to a defense. For other people, it's like, well, you didn't go to your civics class. You don't understand how this works and the Sixth Amendment, right to counsel. And really, there's no easy answer because it's an obvious question and it's a legitimate question. And I guess the source of the question is if you know somebody is guilty, how can you represent them? And the answer to that, the very easy answer to that is I never know. And that's not my job. That's why we have a jury system.
Right.
And that's why we have a criminal justice system, so that there's another entity, which is the jury, that makes that decision. I don't like to say that I'm defending the Constitution, because if I'm representing an individual and they are under the impression that the only reason I'm doing this is because there's some words on a piece of paper that some folks wrote 250 years ago, that's my motivation. You're really not in it. Yeah. Right. How can I represent them? I have absolutely no problem representing them. I don't need to believe in everything that they believe in. And I also don't need to sort through the kinds of cases that I'm willing to represent people on in order to feel better. If it's a drug case, it's a drug case. It doesn't mean that I'm all for drugs.
Right.
It just means that this person is charged with this, and I have a skill set that allows me to help them to make sure that if there's not enough evidence against them, that they won't be found guilty, that if there is, that I've made sure everything that needed to be done and to protect them has been done. And so, and if it's a fraud case, that I've gone through all the paperwork, and that I'm going to defend them to make sure that there's no overreach, and that there's no spillover and finding them guilty for something that maybe a corporation did or somebody else did. I don't have any problem with that. That doesn't mean that I'm all for fraud. Oftentimes people would ask me, well, you certainly don't do the child pornography cases, or, people who've been accused of things that have to do with child pornography or children. And I say, yes, there's no difference. I mean, I don't make a differentiation between the kinds of cases, because just because I represent somebody in a drug case and I don't represent them in a child porn case doesn't mean that I believe in drugs, but I don't believe in that child porn. No, I don't believe in crime. And being, that's another thing, is that being a criminal defense lawyer doesn't mean that I'm pro-crime. It doesn't mean that I'm pro-chaos. In fact, I would view it quite the opposite. I believe in the rule of law.
Right.
I believe that if everyone does their job to the best of their ability, the right outcome will come out. When we see very skewed results, very unfair results, what we would consider not right results, it's because somebody has dropped the ball, whether it's the prosecutor, whether it's the defense attorney, whether it's the judge, whether it's the jury. Here in South Florida, we've had our share of any of those.
Sure.
And eventually it comes to light. But I strongly believe in the rule of law. And I believe that everyone has a task to fulfill, and that as long as everyone is doing that to the best of their ability, that's what our criminal justice system, that's how it was built.
Right.
It is not the most perfect justice system in the world. I haven't seen one. I've worked a lot internationally.
I haven't seen one better, have you?
No,
Yeah.
I have not seen one that's
know,
better. This is a transparent.
Certainly not going to be better to have a 3-panel judge or a 1-panel judge, sentence everybody and make the findings of fact on that. So because I say the same thing on the civil side. It's flawed, but it's better than any justice system in the world. So you got to take it with its flaws. There is no perfect system on that.
I don't think I've answered your question though, and I don't think I've answered the question that a lot of people have. How can I represent somebody that's been accused of something horrible? I represent them because they're entitled to a defense, because I have the skill set to look through and make sure that their rights are protected, and because that's what our government requires. And I don't have any problem representing anybody, notwithstanding what they've been accused of.
All right. So that's got to lend me to this question. What's the most bizarre case you recall in defending that just the facts were, we're going to leave names out or anything else, but what was the most sort of bizarre thing you had to deal with?
Bizarre.
Yeah.
Wow. You threw me for a loop there.
Well, we got the Constitution and all that, but let's just talk some facts or something. And then I want to move on to some of your teaching stuff. But
so, at the Federal Defender's Office and at the State Public Defender's Office, generally, you don't get a lot of media attention because the media cases go to the lawyers who are in private practice. And now I wouldn't be surprised if I had somebody who had a lot of media exposure. But at the Public Defender Office level, you don't often get it. But every now and then you do.
Right.
And I think the bizarre cases are where the media is very involved, because one of the strangest things to have happen. Now, so for people who don't know, cameras are allowed in the state system, but the cameras are not allowed in federal court.
Right.
And so anything that is being reported because somebody is sitting there taking notes and then comes out and reports it and whatever. One of the strangest things that happens is that when you are in the trial, you know what happened because you were standing there, you were asking questions, you were objecting, you were in the mix, right? And then you read in the newspaper the next day about what happened and you went, were they?
Yeah,
were they in the same courtroom with me? Because I don't remember that happening. I think bizarre, more than in the courtroom, bizarre things happen in the course of the investigations. I think most of my colleagues would agree with me that the most bizarre things happen when you're out in the field. And I'm one of those persons that definitely enjoys going with the investigators to go look for witnesses, interview witnesses, look at sites,
right.
Look at the crime scene, do those investigations. I think it's imperative for any trial lawyer who is talking about a crime scene in the courtroom to have visited that crime scene. So the strange things that happen to us is when we're out there, it might be, okay, let's see what the crime scene was like at 11:30 at night. And you might be in one of those areas where you're not entirely sure you're safe, and it's 11:30 at night, and you're going, okay, well, now I know what this looks like.
Right.
Those things are bizarre. Media intervention is bizarre. As far as accusations, if it's in the code, it's not going to be bizarre, generally speaking. There are some very sad cases, but bizarre is mostly limited to things in investigations.
Right.
When we find witnesses in some of the cases, I found witnesses that were strip bars, held up in drug houses, hiding under tarps so that they wouldn't be called. I mean, so yeah, those are the things that are really strange.
That's the fun part.
That is a lot of fun.
It's getting your hands dirty. I've done the same thing, and I agree with you. Even on the civil end, and I teach my students that it's like, if it's a car accident, drive by the scene, know what the intersection, don't just look at the 3 pictures that you've got with a police report, go down there and take a look around, because it gives you a different perspective of everything. And yeah, being hands-on, I think really, really helps. So, all right, in addition to all the defense work, you and I have shared and have taught at the litigation skills program at Miami for a long time now. You've gone well above and beyond that. Okay. And teach internationally and everything else. So talk about the passion there. I mean, I really enjoy teaching at Miami, and always have. And I think it just kind of keeps you fresh with some perspective of having to review rules and go over things and listen, learning. We're in the midst of the pandemic. I got to tell you, Judge Butchko and I did a final trial, obviously all via Zoom. This girl did a closing that one would have been stellar in person, but now had her PowerPoint as her screen behind her, was a little talking head on it, and could move around it. Okay. Was the most engaging closing I've seen in a long, long time. And of course, I had to ask her afterwards, okay, technology, what did you do there? Because we're all dealing with Zoom. So it's also a learning process, but you branched even further than that. I mean, you ran Miami for a year, but internationally you do all kinds of stuff. So what drew you to that, and how did that all play out?
What drew me to that is exactly the same thing that drew me to this practice to begin with, which is the concept that, rule of law is imperative, that there is transparency in our justice systems, in our legal systems. And there wasn't a lot of that in a lot of the areas and a lot of the countries where I started teaching. So let me just address very briefly what you just mentioned, though. It's not a completely altruistic concept. I mean, very much so. The more you teach,
sure,
the fresher you are, the more often you need to read your rules of evidence and you need to read rules of procedure. It keeps you fresh, and it keeps you engaged in that practice. And so it's very important to me for that reason as well. But there were 2 things that helped me. Number one, I am fluent in Spanish. And so when there was a need for teaching trial skills in Central and South America, and they identified that there were a sufficient number of trial lawyers in the United States who were fluent enough to be able to teach it in another country, those programs began to flourish. And I just happened to be in that place in the right time. But so what has happened, very briefly, for what has happened in Central and South America, is that where those systems, those criminal justice systems, were mostly written and inquisitorial systems, where the prosecution was the magistrate judge that was handling the investigation, and the defense attorney's role was de minimis.
Okay.
Those systems have been slowly changing to an adversarial program or an adversarial system that mirrors what we have in the Anglo-Saxon system of jurisprudence, which is that there's one side over there, one side over here, and then the judge is just an arbiter of what is happening, right? So it's a triangular system. And whereas before it was all done by a prosecution office, and the defense attorney just made sure that the code was correctly cited and that the proper punctuation was done. Those countries have now switched over to a system that mirrors ours, but nobody knew how to work within that system. Number one, they weren't used to this adversarial system where your voice was heard equally as mine.
Right.
And that the judge was the one that was going to ultimately make the decision, who had nothing to do with either of those. The other thing was that everything was done in writing. And the way we persuade when we are writing something is very different than the way that we persuade when we are speaking. And it's a completely different skill set.
That's why I hire appellate lawyers. Okay.
Right.
When you got to write it all up, persuade that I want somebody else to do it. I'll do it in the courtroom.
Right.
Yeah.
And that skill set may translate over, but generally does not.
Right.
And, to be truthful, I prefer to be the one that's persuading orally. I can write,
sure,
and it's part of my practice. But if I had my druthers, I would rather speak about it than write about it.
Right.
So there were a lot of people that were these systems that their governments had switched over their jurisprudential systems, especially in the criminal world, and nobody really was good at figuring out how to do this. So the United States, through the USAID programs, funded different organizations, or granted, or I guess provided grants to different organizations to take on those training programs in Central and South America. The biggest example, and where I do the most amount of my work currently, is Mexico. Mexico actually completely changed its constitution in 2006, calling for a complete overhaul of their criminal justice system. It began in 2008, and the idea was that it was completely implemented by 2016. And during the course of those 8 years, lawyers had to switch over from being an inquisitorial written system to an oral adversarial system. And so a lot of the training that I did was to train professors, practicing lawyers, and now law students on how to function in an oral adversarial system like the one that we handle, the one that we, like what we do here. And it's incredibly gratifying.
Right.
I mean, it is to see people learn a new skill set. I tell them regularly, if the tables were turned and someone switched my criminal justice system that I function in and made it all written and told me that I had to function in a different world, I'm not entirely sure I would just soak my head in a bucket and go away.
Right.
Because it's different. I mean, that's not what you signed up for.
Right.
And so I give them a lot of credit. And then the law students don't have any prior experience. And so they're just like my law students at the University of Miami Law School. They're learning for the first time.
So they're clueless too then.
They're clueless too.
Okay.
But the benefit of those is that
it's a clean slate.
It's a clean slate. And because we have what we have now in social media, and because of movies and television, our system gets shown on television in Law and Order after 20-something seasons and many syndications throughout the world. People are familiar with what that looks like, what it looks like to stand up and say objection,
Right.
What it looks like to give an opening statement, what it looks like to give a closing argument. They're a little bit more familiar with that. So younger students tend to see that on television and they go, okay, I remember, I've seen that before. I think I know how to do that. Obviously they don't, but it's easier when they are open to it.
Right.
As opposed to somebody who's done a different practice altogether for the last 20 years, and now we're asking them to speak in public, and they never had to. So.
Well, the problem with that is, though, they want to be able to find the body in the first 5 minutes of the show, and then within an hour, including commercial breaks, have the entire thing tried and go to a jury verdict and have it all happen.
The other problem, in addition to the misconception of how quickly this can happen, the other problem, and I think this is more for prosecutors than it is for defense attorneys, is that there is a misconception that I can pick up a fiber from your pants and take it over to some forensic office, and they can find out where you bought these pants, how much you paid for them, who was with you, what kind of method you used to pay for it, and where those pants have traveled in the last 5 years. It's like crazy.
It's a topic of conversation and jury selection all of the time.
Sure.
So, well, listen, I have really, really enjoyed catching up, and hopefully now people have gotten to know my good friend and great lawyer, Celeste Higgins, and we could probably scratch her off that kill list. And I look forward to continuing to teach with you and watching things go, because it's been a fun run so far, and it could be fun to see where it goes. So
I agree. Thank you so much for having me on and for inquiring, and hopefully maybe I've inspired at least one person to get into this field. Exactly.
And God knows we need them. Like I said, I think it's the most valued position in the legal field when you look at criminal, because the state and the feds, they've all got their prosecutors, but to be able to have people on the other side to defend it, but it takes a rare calling of somebody like yourself to be able to take that role and say, no, this is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to make sure these people are defended.
Well, that's what I do.
Wonderful. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Join us next week on First Off, Let's Kill All the Lawyers. And until then, have a great week.